Welcome to Interviews from Quito. My name is Gregory Wilpert, and today I'm joined by Daniel Ortega. This is the Daniel Ortega of Ecuador. He's the Minister of the Environment, recently named as such, and previously, before that, he was also coordinating the negotiations for the climate talks of Ecuador and of CELAC, the community of Latin American and Caribbean nations. So we're really lucky to have him here today, especially because by the time this interview will be airing, the COP21 climate change negotiations will be taking place in Paris. And so this will be the main focus of our discussion today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Craig, for the opportunity.
So the first thing I want to talk about is kind of start more general, and then we'll talk about some more specific things having to do with Ecuador. But I just want to start with the negotiations in Paris. What do you think are the chances that this will lead to a result, a binding result that will prevent an increase of the global temperature of more than 2 degrees centigrade, which is the supposed goal of these negotiations?
I think that we are arriving to Paris at a very important time. Ecuador is the pro-tempore presidency for CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, and we have been working the whole year and even previously in a way to build consensus. We understand this is a geopolitical debate. We cannot miss point there and get confused with specific details. What we are trying to do here is to get a deal that will more or less condition the way that we can eradicate poverty in the next few years. So we need to take this very seriously. By the time that we get to Paris, my expectations are a bit hopeful. I remain cautiously optimistic. But there will be no fair deal if we do not have means of implementation such as financial resources, technological transfer, and capacity building. But I think that we have a leverage a little bit in this context with the community of Latin American states. We have been in close contact with the African Union. We have been in close contact as well with Asia. So if we can put all these forces together, we will be in a more balanced table.
One of the things that leading up to the negotiations that all the countries were supposed to do is submit an estimate of how much they think that they can reduce their CO2 emissions and or greenhouse gas emissions. And according to one calculation that I've seen, if you add all of that up, it would actually lead to an increase in global temperature of something like over 3 degrees centigrade. So that's kind of shocking if you think about that this is what coming into the negotiations people or countries have been said they're willing to do. What do you think will it take in order to get that lower, in other words, to this 2-degree goal that is necessary in order to prevent a catastrophic situation for the global climate and for human civilization, really?
Our preference is in terms of a legally binding agreement. And what you just mentioned exemplifies why. If you have a loosely binding agreement, everybody will do what they can. Sometimes what you can do is also pressure because you have a structure of incentives that motivates you to do more. Somebody has provided an example with when you have to pay your electric bill. If electricity will be free to everyone to decide how much to pay, perhaps we will never reach the total amount that we need. And it's the same in terms of climate. The measure that you mentioned was estimated by UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program, that at this point of time, if we put all together the commitments that have been put in the table, we will surpass 3 degrees. For us, that will mean that the burden on climate change will even increase, and for other countries, they will likely to disappear. Ecuador has lost in the glaciers, in like Cotopaxi, for instance, 30 to 40% of the glacier has melted. That affects not only our drinking water sources, our capacity to produce, but also because that water drains to the Amazon, we perceive there will be large impact in the ecosystems that are most vulnerable. In that context, what I perceive we need is a legally binding agreement. But even a legally binding agreement empty of resources and technological means, it will be with no ambition in terms of implementation. What we hope is that this exercise has demonstrated that we cannot walk that path, and perhaps the information that is available for civil society will provide additional social demand.
You've been accompanying the process, the negotiation process, for a long time now. I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what that has been like, what has been the ups and downs and the changes in the positions, and particularly considering that the US government, for example, has been interfering in the sense of trying to change individual governments' position based on the amount of aid they want to give to them, and that also at one point in the negotiation process, the issue of binding agreement was taken out of the whole negotiation. Now it seems it might have been put back in again. What has that process been like in the past year?
Well, our region, Latin America and the Caribbean, through CILAC, has been building consensus around the notion of climate justice. And what we perceive is that when you try to weaken up this conception that we still have poverty, we have 69 million people living in extreme poverty, we cannot justify an unfair treatment. And if countries perceive that we are already moving away from a developing conception of our pathway, I think they are truly mistaken. We cannot allow a country to kidnap the process in a way that put us in the front of the action. There is a historical responsibility. There is an ecological debt that needs to be paid. And if a country needs additional political strength to go through Congress and have a law approved, it is the same what we have to do. It will not be easy. We have to put together private and public sector, and it will build more this consensus among some of the ideas, and will bring more constraints to the stability of our democracy. It will only bring more insecurity and the weakening of peace.
And turning to the issue of CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, they recently agreed on a joint position. Can you briefly tell us what that position is? And that's apparently the main negotiating position for all the members of the Central American, Latin American countries. What is that position?
Our community is a big family. And like any family, sometimes it's difficult to get in agreements. But simply the process of dialogue among us, among these 33 countries with different economies, different perceptions of government, and different arrangements on how society participates in decision making, shows the world that dialogue can actually deliver. We are still in the phase to a little bit sharp out the edges of our common position. There are some small areas that we need to get into agreement, but we are truly sure that we will get into a common position by Paris for our high-level authorities to presenting different statements. At this point of time, I can perceive that there are three major areas of emerging consensus. One is that we need a legally binding agreement. Two is that we need sufficient financial resources to get climate ambition ongoing, even for our own economies, recognizing that Latin America and the Caribbean only contribute to 9% of the total emissions. And in a country like Ecuador, only pollutes 0.001% of total emissions. So we are, I think, as a region, we are doing our fair share. What we hope is others can also do it. And the third element of our common position, I would say, there is a clear understanding for the region. The Caribbean states are facing large vulnerabilities, providing their circumstances of a small island development states. Of course, we also have other countries' vulnerabilities, like in Central America, and countries like Ecuador that will face the largest and the most powerful El Nino in the last 10 years.
Is the positions that Ecuador is taking in this talks any different from that of CELAC? I mean, do you make any distinction, or is it really the same?
I will say that Ecuador is trying to build consensus and contribute productively to the final agreement that we believe should be fair in terms of social and environmental justice. And what we have found out is that we can get strong positions and increase our leverage through our groups. And I will not only mention CELAC, but I will also mention ALBA. This effort that was put forward by President Chavez, it has a lot of connotation in the climate context. Sometimes we forget, but in 2009, when we were in Copenhagen, where ALBA countries, those that denounced that an agreement was negotiated in a closed room with no access to some of the developing countries, and was seeking to have this imposition on the table. That really was in detriment of the transparency of the process and the capacity to deliver. So I have my hopes that ALBA will put again the voice of those of have the largest needs in the world, and will also have a strong position in terms of principle. There is a problem with ecological debt. There is a problem in the way that we are weakening up our opportunities to eradicate poverty. And ALBA is simply the messenger for that. But CELAC can also put together some of our own preferences, understanding that the whole region faces vulnerabilities, poverty, and other elements. Of course, the positions that CELAC can have will always be in terms more broadly, but politically strong. When you talk about Ecuador, we are delivering at home. We have invested about in between $5 to $7 billion in changing our energy matrix, and we hope we will surpass 90% of renewals in our energy matrix by 2017. We are also introducing cookstoves. We are revising our energy subsidies policy. I think we are doing our fair share at home. We provide us with moral legitimacy to also propose big ideas at the international level. President Correa has put forward the eco tax, the daily Correa tax, that is seeking to establish a levy in the barrel of oil between 3 to 5%. Only that conception can mobilize $30 to $50 billion per year. That is about the half what we need from the Green Climate Fund that I'm pretty sure you should know is not getting beyond 10 billion at this point, after all these years of negotiation. And like that proposal, President Correa is also putting forward the idea of compensating for environmental services that developing countries are providing to the world for the climate stability itself. And that is simply a fair notion. We have to pay a lot for technologies, everything that we have, cell phones and whatnot. So we believe that the services that are provided by our forests should be compensated for the benefits of the communities living on those forests, and because they still face the poverty challenges. So those are some of the few examples that we're putting on the table that we believe Ecuador can provide additional inputs in the negotiation without the fact that we need to act as blocks if we really want to have an echo.
Actually, the policies, the environmental policies of Ecuador is actually something else that I was going to ask you some more about, specifically also because one of the issues that people often don't think about when they talk about climate change is the role of deforestation. And that's certainly an issue that Ecuador, I understand, is also concerned about. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what Ecuador's policies are around that, and also the transition. You mentioned, for example, the transition to completely going away from fossil fuels. Just give us a little more detail about that as well.
So previously we said that if we put together all the national determined contributions, we were going beyond the 3 degrees increase in temperature. We can also see that from a different perspective. If you aggregate all the contributions, you will get about 50% of what we really need for the goal. When you think about combating deforestation, you could contribute with additional 20%. For instance, REDD+, other countries will perceive other type of mechanisms like the joint mitigation adaptation on forests. But if we look at forests, they can provide you 20% of additional reductions for climate purposes. This has to be considered in the context, of course, of historical responsibilities. Forests are in our ground and communities are living there. So if we want to provide for sustainable development, both environmental, but also social and economic, we need to think in the alternatives that we have. And not only because of emissions, but because of the co-benefits associated with it. Ecosystem services, the communities, cultural values, and whatnot. So I think that if we tackle deforestation as well, all the studies have put the notion in front of us that we can reduce the total cost of climate mitigation about 20%. So for me, forest is a no-brainer. It will have to be in the agreement. There is no explanation why forests have not moved forward, not even now in Paris, but even in the last 3 COPs. What we really hope is that this time around, we will get a clear result for forests.
And in terms of moving away from fossil fuels, how is Ecuador doing that? In what way is it achieving such a, especially as an oil-producing country, how is it achieving such a transition?
It's a very difficult challenge because you need to be pretty savvy in a way that you present these potential policy changes. Subsidies at the end of the day benefit the poorest. So what you need to do is you need to calibrate policies so those incentives goes to the people that really needs them. What we have discovered, there is a lot of leakage in terms of these subsidies, and we are trying to correct them. For instance, if you have a very large sport utility vehicle that consumes a lot of fossil fuel, you will be provided with a smart car that will tell you a total quota of that you can consume. If you go beyond that, you will have to pay the real value. What we do, even though we are an oil exporting country, is that we import derivatives and then we subsidize in 50% the total value. That has a lot of impact in our total gross product. In a year where the barrel of oil is where it is, below $40, it is of particular concern for us. We need those resources to continue the change of our productive matrix so that we can really do a transition from an oil-producing economy and diversify to services.
Returning to the climate negotiations, if I understand that if the talks don't result in a binding agreement that will lead towards a maximum of 2 degrees Celsius temperature increase, if we don't achieve that, this could also have a major impact on Ecuador. Can you tell us a little bit about what kind of an impact that has and why is Ecuador vulnerable to climate change?
Well, as I mentioned, climate change is affecting right now our drinking water sources, the sources for water for irrigating agricultural fields. But also, if you look at the Amazonian, the biodiversity is being affected by the increase in temperature. Reptiles and others are pretty sensitive to changes in temperature. But I think that the largest impact of climate change is on people. UNICEF has demonstrated that climate change is the source for the large mass of migration around the world. If you affect production, you affect food security, you will have people moving around, and the crisis that we are already confronting in migration, it will be even higher. We understand that in the next 100 years, about 1 billion people will be migrating from one place to other because of climate change. But at the same time, UNICEF have determined that climate change is affecting the children. Because of vectors and other type of diseases have been pushing from tropical areas to other areas that they used not to go, and we are losing a lot of lives. So climate change is not a game. We understand it's a matter of life.
Now, going into this agreement, which will be starting and will have started by the time this interview airs, what do you are you optimistic or more pessimistic in terms of what the agreement that might come out of it?
As I mentioned, I think that I'm cautiously optimistic. And why is that? Because if ALBA delivered back in 2009 denouncing an agreement and have had an active role since then in the negotiations, everybody has recognized our productive and positive role in the negotiations, always pushing for more and ambition, not blocking like some have denounced, but pushing for more and ambition. I think that ALBA will have a critical role in Paris. And we, during the meeting of CELAC that we have back in November the 6th, we also had a meeting of the ministers of ALBA that were present in that meeting. And they were convinced that we can put together an agenda and a strategy that can really contribute to Paris Agreement. But at the same time, we have been able to provide positive inputs in the CELAC discussions. We are influencing the LMDC, which is a like-minded developing countries group, which is a large group from with more than 40 countries. With those echo chambers, we believe we can provide a more balanced table for negotiations. It will not be easy. The debates between China and United States, the negotiation taking place between Europe and United States, the negotiation that France is taking itself with the United States will also condition the results. But we need to keep the faith in what we can do, because we are doing things at home, even though we are vulnerable, and we are putting on the table something else, not only hope, what we are putting on the table real alternatives. Nobody else is putting alternatives like Ecuador is doing, not only examples at home, but also President Correa has put forward the idea of the eco-tax, daily Correa. We have put forward the concept of net avoided emissions, leaving behind the old concept of Kyoto of offsetting emissions. And we are putting forward the idea that also technology needs to be accessible so that we can implement technology that can save lives. So that's what's providing me optimism. I should also say on a personal side that I'm being in this negotiation as a negotiator for quite a bit. And now this position to be a minister provides us for a little bit more of room to provide inputs in the high-level discussions like the other members of ALBA are doing as well.
Mm-hmm. Of course, one of the things that some people think when they think about the Paris talks is that, well, if we don't reach an agreement now, we'll just do it next year. And so things get pushed off, obviously. But what do you see as being the consequence? Is there another chance if an agreement isn't reached, or is this it?
I think that this is even more complicated, because if we have a loosely binding agreement now, we will be introduced in a war of a 5-year cycle. Every 5 years we will have to come back and see what we have done and try it again. But climate change does not allow you for that room. The action needs to take place now. So we are going to Paris with a clear notion that we need to reach a fair binding agreement at Paris.
Well, one of the main issues seems to me is that, of course, the negotiation between the developing countries and the developed world, where it seems to me kind of crazy always, where they talk about, oh, China, for example, is the largest CO2 emitter, but of course completely leaving out the historical factor and the fact that China has 4 times the population of the United States. I mean, what do you think needs to happen to change that mentality in the North, particularly in the United States? I mean, this seems to me just kind of outrageous thing to say, that a country that does not have this history of emissions and does not have the per capita emissions as the United States is saying, oh, you guys need to do much more than we are, or more than what.
I think that there are 2 elements to counter-argue that. One is that you need to put those emissions, and not because I'm defending China. I think everybody has to do what they can, and China is doing a lot at home as well in terms of renewable energies and other programs. But because of other countries that are in the same situation like us, you always need to weigh up the emissions relative to the population. And secondly, you also need to weigh those emissions per population in terms of consumption and not production. For instance, an agricultural country like Ecuador is exporting a lot of products to Europe, but we export those products because they demand it. So we need to share that. Of course, it's a share boarding exercise, that's the case, but we cannot allocate all those emissions from banana production, transportation, and delivering only to Ecuador. So I think that's what is on the table here. We don't want an agreement that can provide for arguments for non-technical barriers on trade and other distortions, because it will really affect us. We are in a country, because we are all producing, that our balance of payment is being affected in the reduction of income from exports. So if we have additional restrictions, we are talking about an agreement that can really condition our way to develop. The climate change is a problem of a historical debt that conditions our present and can also establish a mortgage on our future.
Okay, well, we've run out of time, but thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for joining us at Interviews from Quito. My name is Gregory Wilpert, and today my guest was Daniel Ortega, the Environment Minister of Ecuador, and I hope you join us next time.